Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Clinical Trials 101 with Dr. Lee Rosen, brought to you by the Anal Cancer Foundation. My name is Justine Almada, and I am a co-founder of the Anal Cancer Foundation, and I will be moderating today's event. The purpose of today's webinar is to explain navigating the clinical trials process and to give you an opportunity to ask questions of our expert. Before we begin, there are a few items I'd like to review. Next slide. Today is the first of our 2022 Expert Hour webinars. We created these webinars so that our patient community could hear directly from and ask questions of experts in the field. For far too many, including my own family, there just wasn't enough information available to us during our anal cancer journey. Next slide. We are committed to changing that experience for the anal cancer community. We want to empower you with the same information as your doctors in order to have more in-depth and productive conversations about your care. All of us at ACF greatly appreciate your making the time to participate today. I would like to extend our deep gratitude to an anonymous donor who understands these challenges and whose generous support makes these webinars possible. I would also like to give my thanks to a group of advanced anal cancer thrivers who worked with us on the content of Clinical Trials 101. Next slide. Our next webinar in the series is Immunotherapy 101 and will be held on Thursday, April 21st at noon Eastern Time with expert Dr. Julia Strauss. The purpose of the immunotherapy webinar is to understand how your immune system works when you have anal cancer and to discuss emerging therapies that might help it. Next slide. We have exciting news that this Monday is Anal Cancer Awareness Day. We will be using all of next week to educate people about anal cancer and shine a light on anal cancer thrivers and their stories. On Monday, we'll be asking members of our community to take a photo with anal cancer awareness, hold it up in front of you, and share it on their networks. We will also post anal cancer facts that you can share in your communities. More details will be on our Facebook and Twitter pages. We hope you will participate and please help us spread the word. Next slide. If you're new to us, the Anal Cancer Foundation is dedicated to ending anal cancer and improving the lives of those affected by it. I started it with my brother Tristan and sister Camille after losing our mom to HPV-related anal cancer when she was 53 years old. Clinical trials for anal cancer did not exist at the time, and we were determined to change that. At the foundation, we advocate for better prevention, treatment, and support. If you're looking to speak with a peer who shares the anal cancer experience or get involved in any other way, please email us at connect@analcancerfoundation.org. I'll now turn to our special guest for the day, Dr. Rosen. Dr. Rosen is a health sciences clinical professor of medicine at UCLA and has a special focus on gastrointestinal malignancies. He created and directed the Cancer Therapy Development Program at UCLA, and he currently directs its drug development program, where he is on a search for new, less toxic, and more effective ways of treating cancers. We want to provide a heads up that there are scans of anal cancer and tumors in this presentation. Following his talk, we will have a question and answer section. The Q&A box is on the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many questions as possible, though Dr. Rosen won't be able to go into the details of individual medical cases. We are ecstatic to have Dr. Rosen with us today and are grateful for the time he took from his very busy schedule to put together this presentation. I will now turn it over to Dr. Rosen.
I really appreciate everybody's time this morning. It's really a pleasure to be able to be here with such an amazing organization. And as I've learned more about the work that the Anal Cancer Foundation does, it's really just such a great partnership for us as we're trying to find new treatments, not only about anal cancer, but about cancers in general. And I think it's great, before we delve into specifics in your future webinars of treatments, to take a kind of step back and say, what is really going on in the world of cancer medicine? And what I hope to convince you today, that even though we're going to be calling this Clinical Trials 101, This is really a discussion about how do you access cancer treatment in general. And what I hope to convince you is that perhaps clinical trials are not really that different than any other treatment that you might be able to access. So we'll talk a little bit about what trials are, how drugs get developed, how you choose particular treatments for yourself or for a family member or a friend, and then have some time for questions at the end. And we'll keep it very, very informal, which is the only way I know how to be. Good. So when we talk about cancer medicine, right, we are thinking about initially tumors that are localized in one place, like anal cancers, and one usually uses radiation and chemotherapy to cure the disease in many, many people. Obviously, we need to find better and less toxic ways to do that. So there might be some clinical trials looking at medicines to support the side effects of chemoradiation or improve upon those treatments as well. We have surgeries in some cases as well. But if the disease comes back, if the disease spreads, we're talking about metastatic disease, typically we use chemotherapy or hormone therapy. And often we bump up against resistance, and certainly we bump up a lot against toxicity. So in today's world, where we're beyond a cytotoxic world, a world where we're killing everything, hoping that the good stuff grows back and the bad stuff dies, we're trying to understand what's different about the cancer cell than the regular cell. And hopefully we direct our therapy there. So here are a bunch of mechanisms of drug action, right? You're probably familiar with various kinds of targeted therapy. On the top, EGFR inhibitors. Those are the drugs that Martha Stewart got in trouble with insider trading that are approved in colon cancer and lung cancer. On the bottom, we talk about angiogenesis inhibitors, drugs that work by cutting off the blood supply. You probably are familiar with immunotherapy, using the immune system to attack and treat the cancer as well. And there's a whole bunch of different mechanisms of action that are going to be targets for drug development in cancer medicine. So let's get a little bit practical, right? Let's try to think about what does a clinical trial mean in the life of this particular patient. A 43-year-old woman gets diagnosed with anal cancer, having been told that there's nothing wrong with her for several weeks or months. Perhaps some of you are familiar with that kind of discussion. But basically, a year ago, February, she receives chemotherapy, mitomycin 5-FU with radiation. A PET scan done a few months later says there's no evidence of disease. There's some thickening in the area of radiation with the constant dance of, is it real or is it just a side effect of the radiation? But she's told that she's cured. Fast forward about 6 months later, she develops some pain in the right upper area of her abdomen, told it was gas, the pain comes and goes, it was sort of followed. But then a couple months later, she's in the emergency room with severe pain and a CAT scan is done. And here is a CAT scan. I hope that you can see my arrow, but if not, this is basically the liver here with tumors in the liver or spots in the liver that are most consistent with recurrent cancer. So what do? She has a biopsy. It's determined that it's a recurrence of her anal cancer. Because she's been so well informed, her tumor's been sent off for what we're going to call molecular profiling, and I'll speak about that in a minute. But she has a discussion with her doctors, and the following choices are outlined. She asks about surgery, but because there are so many tumors in the liver, it's going to be impossible to remove it all, assuming that we all want to keep our liver functioning. But then she's also offered standard chemotherapy, right? There's a bunch of conventional chemotherapy drugs, I've listed them here, where we know exactly what the dose is, exactly what the side effects are, and exactly how well they work. Now, in some patients, they're going to work amazingly well and be without side effects. In others, they're not going to work at all, or they're going to have side effects that are quite disabling. But in all cases, in all probability, when one has this many tumors in one's liver, it's unlikely that these drugs are going to cure the disease. And to an oncologist, when one uses the word cure, it means that the disease is going to go away and stay away forever. Conventional chemotherapy can be delivered right there in one's own doctor's office in one's own town or city. You could take breaks, you could do what you want with the doses. We're going to focus a lot on what clinical trials or experimental therapy means. Her doctor may have discussed certain kinds of radiation therapy, either traditional radiation therapy, which she's very well familiar with, or something called SBRT, stereotactic body radiation therapy, gamma knife, cyber knife, those are all synonyms, where that's very targeted radiation therapy, not usually used in the liver with this many tumors, but could be used in other parts of the body. And then proton beam in a couple of centers around the country has been touted as something that is bigger, better, faster, easier. And the optimist would say it is a lot better, and the pessimist would say it's not really that different than traditional radiation. There are liver-directed therapies. Radiofrequency ablation is putting a probe directly into the tumor in the liver, and either with freezing or with microwave heat, burning, buzzing out the tumor. Again, very difficult to do with multiple tumors, but sometimes when there's one or two, that's possible. Y90, also called chemoembolization or radioembolization or SIR spheres, is where you inject these very tiny radiation beads through the artery that feeds the tumor, and that's going to deliver therapy directly to the liver without getting into the rest of the body. And again, for liver lesions, that's very, very effective. Sometimes with multiple lesions, it's not so. People think about alternative or complementary medicine, and people also think about palliative care or even hospice care when those cases are patients not interested in therapy, willing for therapy, or perhaps too sick for therapy. Not that that means giving up, not that that means throwing in the towel, but perhaps sometimes focusing on symptoms rather than shrinking the cancer is an option for some people. So how do we choose? Well, when we're talking about systemic therapy, and let's kind of focus the rest of our conversation about perhaps conventional chemotherapy, radiation therapy, et cetera, versus something experimental, we ask ourselves, does my therapy have to be FDA approved, or does it have to be FDA approved for anal cancer? One of the biggest misunderstandings is that drugs are developed specifically for a cancer for a rational reason. In some cases, that's true, right? Anti-estrogens in breast cancer are not going to work in colorectal cancer because estrogen is not a driver for that cancer. But a lot of times drugs are developed in breast or lung or colorectal cancer because those are very common diseases. And the drug would work in anal cancer or would work in some other type of cancer. So in some cases, there are drugs on the market that have been shown to have activity, and sometimes insurance companies will allow their use. Or in the case of pills, sometimes companies will have drug replacement programs or patient assistance programs when there are data to show that the drug works, in this case, anal cancer. We have to ask whether the tumor needs to be profiled, and we'll talk about that. When should I consider a clinical trial? How do I find a clinical trial? And how do I know if my therapy would work? I mean, obviously, we in medicine would promise not to keep secrets from you if there's a drug that's going to cure your disease, but sometimes it's impossible to know when we start whether a drug is or isn't going to work or how it's going to be tolerated. True for a clinical trial drug, obviously, as well. So there's a lot spoken about molecular profiling, the idea that under a microscope, tumors, anal cancers, are all going to look very similarly. But what about genetically or molecularly? And I'm speaking specifically now, not about genetics in the sense of things that you inherit or can pass on, but look at them as genetic or molecular characteristics, attributes of your tumor. And so there's a bunch of companies. Foundation Medicine is one of them. Caris, Tempus, Circulogene. There's a bunch of them. They all do essentially the same thing. And the terms molecular profiling, sequencing, next generation sequencing, is proteomics, genomics. Those are all very, very synonymous words. The idea that you take tumor tissue, and it could be from years ago, it could be recently, you send it off to a company and they're going to look at it against 200 or 300 different genes or proteins. Most of the time you don't find anything, or you find things and you have no idea what they mean, but sometimes you'll find a really good match between a characteristic of the tumor in a clinical trial or a characteristic of the tumor and something that could predict whether a drug will or won't work. Now, the problem with this is that we don't know if this changes over time. If you biopsy a tumor every year, every couple of years, every 5 years, will it be the same? We don't even know if someone has a tumor in her lung and liver and you biopsy both of them, will you get the same results? Or if you put 2 needles in the same liver tumor, will you get the same results? So the science is a little bit behind the clinic right now, but it's the best that we have. And it's my opinion that everybody with metastatic disease, not necessarily early stage disease, but everybody with metastatic disease should have their tumor profiled. It's often covered by insurance. And if it's not, the companies are really good about patient assistance programs. But here's the information that you get, right? And you can see this list of genomic alterations identified, right? So PIK is a very common tumor in a bunch, a very common marker in a bunch of tumors. P53 is something that's probably there in all tumors. And there are various kinds of things. And then depending on the disease, you'll sort of see this analysis. Hey, you have this mutation, these drugs are likely or not likely to work. It also comes with 25 pages of available clinical trials. And sometimes this is great information and sometimes it's not, because the trials are either not really appropriate or they're not even open. But at least the molecular information is what's important to get. Sometimes you can't get biopsies. And so we can think about doing this profiling on the blood. And again, we hope that the blood and the tumor tissue are just as accurate. This is a company called Guardant 360, but a lot of them do it. And again, same kind of thing. And people are wondering if you could use these types of analyses to look at treatment, right? As treatment's successful, the percentages or the amounts of these circulating tumor DNA cells go down, and we really haven't validated that quickly either. So there's a lot of exploration on using blood tests before CAT scans. You might see things before CAT scans and the pros and cons of that as well. We don't know if blood and tumor tissue are just as good, so I prefer tumor tissue, but if all we can get is blood, all we can get is blood. Now, which marker do we use, right? And there's a whole bunch of markers that are talked about, not just in anal cancer, but in cancers in general. And off to the side of this slide, you see a tree with multiple branches, because it really illustrates what we're talking about in the use of these profiling tests. If we wanted to think about our cancer as a tree and we want to kill the tree, we want to kill it at its trunk. Now, how do we know if any of these markers are the trunk of the tree, the trunk of the cancer, and cutting them off is very meaningful? Or how do we know if these markers are just top little branches where it's great to cut them off, but it's not really going to do anything for the cancer? And that's also important and unanswerable in many, many cases. But sometimes the purpose of the clinical trial is to kind of go forward and try to understand, how do we know which marker is important, and is a marker in general important for a drug or not? So in my opinion, clinical trials should not be thought of any differently than any other treatment, because we're always asking, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? What will it cost? And I don't mean in terms of money, but I mean in terms of time and in terms of side effects, right? What am I accomplishing? What is it costing me? What drug am I getting? How much is known about the drug? What dose am I getting? So if I'm the first person ever to take a drug in the world, that might be a little bit riskier than if I say, take Tylenol and aspirin, put it together in the first time. That's not such a great mystery that it's okay to try that combination of Tylenol and aspirin for a headache. Well, how do we judge treatment success, right? Most of us are thinking about response rate, right? Is my tumor shrinking? And arbitrarily, we have these very rough ideas of how to judge cancer drugs based on whether they shrink. Now, again, if cancers shrink, we presume it means you're going to feel better or live longer. So we talk about something called RECIST criteria, and those are criteria based on measuring various tumors on scans. A complete response is obvious, the cancer completely goes away. By the way, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's gone, because it could be microscopically there and just not able to be seen. A partial response is going to be 30% shrinkage, and you can kind of agree with me that 31% shrinkage is still really good, although that would be called stable disease. Excuse me, 29% shrinkage would be called stable disease. So 29, 30, 31, it's quite arbitrary. And progressive disease is defined as 20% growth, because we acknowledge that things might measure a little bit differently depending on where you were in the CAT scan that particular day, or it might grow a little bit because the tumor is inflamed, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the drug isn't working. Back to our question of what am I accomplishing and what is it costing? And we have to remember that people just don't fit into perfect boxes. So we do the best that we can. And ultimately, this is all about individualizing therapy between you and your treating doctor. Time to progression is a variable that we'll use to judge success. How long does it take before the cancer grows? So if it takes 6 months or 6 years instead of 6 minutes, that's a good thing in terms of a drug working, even if it doesn't shrink the cancer. Survival is ultimately the important goal, but we don't want to wait until that point. But endpoints such as how do I feel and how am I living and what are my side effects and what's my life like, I think is just as important as measuring things on a CAT scan. So here's our CAT scan again, and what the arrows are basically showing you is just the attempt to measure the longest diameter. Tumors are not perfect spheres, so depending on where you measure, things could look bigger or smaller. That's why it's important to measure in the same place at the same time. But basically, the way that we do this is we pick representative lesions, not every single lesion, measure them, add them up, and do that percentage calculation. And in the individual decision, remember what we're talking about today is the individual decision between a patient and his or her doctor. There are different decisions when the FDA or some European regulatory agency is looking at thousands or hundreds of patients and hundreds of scans. That's why their perspective is going to be very different. You may have a little bit more growth and still be allowed to continue on a drug, whereas a regulatory agency still has to make a decision of, is this drug safe or is this drug worth approving? So how do we know if treatment is worth it? Well, here's our example that I keep showing you. And if I give this person a drug and I repeat a CAT scan 2 months later, where you can see that the liver is completely clean, I don't think any of us would disagree that that's a really good drug, right? Cancer is gone on that scan, easy to decide. What about a person with lung cancer here? And you can see these spots in the lung, the white fluffy spots are areas of tumor. And I'm going to show you in next scan, was it better here or was it better here? Which is better? And obviously it's exactly the same. But if I told you that the interval between those two scans was 6 years, and in those 6 years, that person was on a pill that had very mild, if any, side effects, again, we wouldn't measure that as a response, but we'd all agree that that's a really good drug and that I'd want to take that drug. 6 years in a person whose cancer had been growing wildly through chemotherapy before. So that's back to how does a person look and how does a person feel that we won't necessarily see on a scan. All right, so when we're thinking about clinical trials, to me, the most important perspective to think about is the perspective of a patient, right? A patient wants access to promising therapy. They don't want to be too early. They don't want to be too late in the course of their disease to get this therapy. They want treatment options when other therapies are exhausted, or maybe there are lots of options, but they don't want the toxicity of those options. Treatment for rare diseases, treatment when there's insurance issues, treatment guided by that molecular profiling we were speaking about, hopes of avoiding chemotherapy if they can. They want to be aware of time commitment, travel, and cost. With most of us willing to go to the moon, if that's going to mean curing our cancer, but if it's going to mean feeling the same, if not sicker, but being alive for 5 minutes longer, probably don't want to leave my community. But I want to make you aware of, not that it's more important, but make you aware of what about the perspective of the drug, right? Or the drug company or the person developing the drug. Do you have different strategies for different drugs, whether they're traditional cancer drugs where I really will be able to see a response on a scan, or these targeted drugs where it may not shrink or it may not grow, and how do I show that? Is this drug a truly new, brand new mechanism of action, or is it just a Me Too drug? What about pills versus IV? Is the drug that I'm developing expected to be a single agent or part of a combination? Is the drug going to cure the disease or palliate the disease? What about advanced disease? What about prevention? And is it a small company or a big company that has resources to spend? From the perspective of the person doing the clinical trial, usually a university cancer researcher, they have their scientific interests. They have the best interests of patients. Their job is to protect patient safety, meet regulatory requirements, but they need sufficient funding and personnel and facilities. And their job is to understand what the drug does, how it's metabolized, what its side effects are, how we know if it's working, and what we want to combine it with. And whether they're going to test it in a really common disease, lung cancer, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, or whether they're going to test it in everything and allow for the surprises. Well, let's kind of think about our idea in the laboratory. Here's a model of a tumor that was implanted in a mouse, and you can see that with this drug, over time, the tumor almost disappears. It doesn't completely go away, but it almost disappears. So animal models are important, but when we get to a phase 1 trial, we're trying to evaluate how a new drug is given, how often, and what dose is safe. We're ready for the clinic. So phase 1 trials might be a brand new drug that's never been tested before. It might be a brand new mechanism of action that's never been tested before. But a phase 1 trial could also be aspirin and Tylenol tested together for the first time, or some such drug that used to be given once a month that's now being given in a lower dose once a week to see if it could be more tolerated. So phase 1 trials may not be that experimental. Back to my comment of one should care about what's the drug, how much is known about it, and what dose am I going to be getting. Here's a very typical design, right? We bring in 3 patients at the low dose. If they're okay, they continue, and 3 new patients go on the next dose. And we keep ratcheting it up until we start to see moderate side effects. We get unexpected side effects, we go back down, and we declare what the dose is. Sometimes as we're marching up with single drug, as you can sort of see on the top curve, we're going to combine it with another drug and lag it behind so that at the end of the trial, we know what the dose of the drug is given by itself, and we know what the drug is when it's given with a combination. Now, if drugs cause cancer shrinkage, that's really easy to see, but sometimes we don't know if we're hitting the target. And so here's an example of using MRIs and PET scans, where you can see that the tumor here has completely gone away. It doesn't really project quite so well, but suffice it to say on this PET scan, here's a tumor in the liver that's quite big, and it becomes completely normal a little bit later. And it corresponds to some shrinkage on an MRI. Here's a big tumor, and here it shrinks. So at the end of phase 1, we have what we think is a safe drug with a very defined dose and schedule, and we understand how it works, where it works by itself. Do we have a predictable way of knowing who's going to respond and who's not? So then a phase 2 trial is going to come, trying to ask, how does a drug work in a small group of similar patients? So if our phase 1 trial took everybody with lots of different cancers, or people with anal cancer that have had multiple different kinds of drugs before, our phase 2 trial is going to be a bigger group with one disease and one set. So maybe it's only anal cancer that has progressed after 1 chemotherapy, or only lung cancer that's had no fewer than 2 chemotherapy drugs before. And here's a very typical phase 2 trial where we're going to identify our dose in phase 1, and then we're going to bring on a group of people with lung, brain, breast, melanoma, colorectal cancer, and see. And so at the end of phase 2, in this very small group, we're going to confirm that, yep, the drug works, yep, the dose is safe, the schedule is safe, and we're going to ask, does it work or does it not? If it doesn't work in the small group, it's not likely to work in a big group, but we're going to be trying to narrow risk. Phase 3 clinical trials are going to be the final stage and asking, how does my new drug compare to standard therapy, right? How does Tylenol compare to aspirin? Or how does Tylenol plus aspirin compare to aspirin by itself, right? So these groups are randomized, right? So this is where a computer is going to decide arm A or arm B. So our group may be an experimental drug versus chemotherapy. It may be an experimental drug and chemotherapy together versus chemotherapy, or it may be a placebo versus chemotherapy, versus experimental drug, excuse me. So all of that is disclosed before you start the trial, and placebo trials are very, very rare in cancer medicine for obvious reasons. So here's a typical design, right? Take people, this is gastric cancer, stomach cancer, HER2 positive, that's a gene that they're randomly assigned to chemotherapy or chemotherapy plus the experimental drug. So here there may be a placebo involved, but everybody gets chemotherapy. If you get chemotherapy plus placebo, you're still getting chemotherapy. And if it's chemotherapy plus the active drug, that's the best way to know. And at the end of the trial, we're going to be generating a curve. And you can see that the orange, the experimental arm, did better, right? This is how long did people live on this particular trial. And you're going to use statistics to say, hey, is this random or is this particularly meaningful? Now, a lot of times people look at these data and say, wow, you improved survival for a month. That's really not that big of a deal. And of course, if something really important happens to that person in the last month of life, a family member having a baby, getting married, or being able to wrap up one's life, that's really important. But remember that if it moves a month, on average, many people are living many, many more months, just that people on the regular arm perhaps are dying very quickly because the traditional therapy isn't very effective. So it's bringing down the average. So averages don't mean that everybody lives exactly that time, as of course you know. How do we develop drugs, right? So there's lots of interactions with the FDA here, right? And there are places in laboratory medicine. We talked about phase 1, 2, 3 trials, and then going forward to the FDA for approval. Research teams involve doctors, research nurses and coordinators, clinical staff, regulatory staff, contracting, budgeting, laboratory, monitoring, and finance. Lots of oversight, the FDA, local ethics committees, local scientific committees, people looking to make sure that insurance isn't being billed inappropriately, real-time safety analysis and safety monitoring, and an annual update of what's known everywhere in the clinical trial. How does one get on a clinical trial? Well, the ideal patient for a clinical trial feels well. They have to be off therapy for somewhere between 3 and 4 weeks. They have to be out of bed at least 50% of the time to be able to get back and forth to the clinic. Blood counts, kidney function, liver function don't have to be perfect. They have to be decent. Different tumors are differently available for clinical trials, time commitment, travel, and balance between active therapy and focusing on symptoms. When you're considering a clinical trial, you get a very, very large consent form that's filled with all the things that could happen. Basically, what do we know about the drug? What are the side effects and what is known internationally? People will have a physical exam. Performance status is that measurement of how healthy are you? Are you out of bed more than 50% of the time? Blood tests, a CAT scan or MRI to stage the cancer. There may be extra tests like heart or eye exams if one thinks that the drug might cause some side effects there. And a lot of trials will require biopsies, maybe 1 or maybe 2, and you can use old tissue often to see how the drug is working. Study visits, you're either there getting the drug or being monitored for physical exams and blood tests. Adverse events is the term that means what are the side effects that you're experiencing. You may have blood tests or urine tests to see how the drug is being metabolized in your body. And of course, you're going to have scans to see whether it's working. Progression will happen, right? And sometimes if the disease looks worse on a scan, but you feel better, one could stay on if something that is called clinical benefit is seen. Sometimes on the randomized studies, you can cross over if you were on the arm that didn't get the active drug. Obviously, if you have a bad side effect or if you choose to withdraw from the trial, that's always possible. If you don't comply, if you don't show up for appointments, if the investigator or sponsor decides that the drug isn't working, a lot of times they will, close the trial. But if people are still on the trial, I would say 99 times out of 100, they'll still provide you with free drug. What about costs? Well, there should be no difference in cost by participating in a clinical trial, right? We bill to insurance the same stuff as if you're getting regular treatment, scans every couple of months, a doctor visit every few weeks, regular labs, but the study should pick up anything beyond that, the cost of the experimental drug itself, extra or more frequent doctor visits, lab scans. The language is very, very clear in the consent form about what your insurance company or you will be responsible for. So whatever costs you have as regular chemotherapy in terms of copays or deductibles should be no different on a clinical trial. And in terms of being able to be seen, if you have an insurance plan that restricts you to a particular medical group, sometimes you'll have to pay out of pocket if you're going to a place that your HMO doesn't allow. Oftentimes, clinical trials will have provisions for that, right? They'll be able to let a lot of the expensive stuff be done in your own network. So it's very, very rare that you'll be out of pocket significant amounts of money for participating in a clinical trial. So how do you know what's best for you? Well, will the treatment option that you're making take you away from treatment options in your future? How do you make a decision with imperfect information? What about the media influences or the parking lot where there's this drug that you absolutely have to have and you will die if you don't have that drug? Or the opposite, that drug is going to kill you, where It's not necessarily clear that whatever you saw on TV or heard about in the parking lot really applies to you. What about using approved medicines for unapproved indications? That's my example of people that have patient assistance programs. How about alternative medicine? Is that better? Is that worse? Is that just as good? Will that affect your participation in a clinical trial? We talked a little bit about insurance companies and managed care restrictions. We talked about the pros and cons of doing something that benefits others. First and foremost, you want to do something that helps you. And that's how we always look. What's going to be best for you? Not the drug, not the clinical trial, but what's going to be best for you. If on the side we can help the rest of people or the people yet to come, of course, that's really, really important. How do you find these clinical trials? Well, you want to start with your doctor, right? You want to start with the doctor that knows you. There may be a major cancer center that he or she is aware of or that's in your local community. The internet is a great source of information. It's a great curse of information, right? The molecular profiling reports can tell you where to find clinical trials. Cancertrials.gov, that's a website that's just filled with tons of information, which is why I really encourage people to go back to their doctor or to find a site of major drug development, which is really common in most big medical schools now. So most people are not too far away from having access to clinical trials. We all know each other. We all go to the same meetings. It's very unlikely that there's a clinical trial somewhere else that we don't know about that's curing cancer. Usually you're going to hear about it, not even in the New York Times or the LA Times, but you're going to hear about it in USA Today. So, a major cancer drug that is successful is going to be in the popular press immediately so. But there are going to be lots of clinical trials that we may not be familiar with, which are just as good or just as bad as anything that's available in one's own community. How do we find? Well, the answers are obviously here, right? They're in the laboratories around the world trying to find new ways of treating cancer, new ways of understanding cancer, and of course, most importantly, new ways of preventing cancer. Those answers are coming, but perhaps not fast enough for the people that have cancer at this moment. They're here in the way that we try to identify which types of anal cancer will respond to this drug or that drug, which types of anal cancer can be watched, and which types of anal cancer have to be removed as well. Population studies, public health studies. And the answers are here. They're in the drug development process, which, believe it or not, works very, very well. Amazing drugs get through very quickly. If a drug sort of futzes for several years, maybe it's not so amazing, but it may help. That whole process of working with the FDA is really, really successful for most cases. So is there something available? Absolutely, yes. There are surgeries, there are standard therapies, and we shouldn't throw out standard therapies. Anal cancer is actually one of the poster children, as hard as the therapy is, for very effective therapy in early stages of disease. But even if it's 1 or 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 people that don't respond to traditional therapy, there are other things to do. There's radiation therapy, ablation and liver-directed therapies. There's alternative complementary medicine, and there's ways of keeping people alive longer by making them feel better and stay at home. But there are clinical trials and there are experimental therapies. And I hope I've convinced you that they're really no different when you're trying to consider what to do next, whether it's the first time you have metastatic disease or the 55th time you have metastatic disease. Put up the list. What are the standard therapies available? What are the experimental therapies available? How do you choose? When do you choose? When do you use each? But beyond all of this, through a very well and interconnected system of patients and advocacy groups and doctors and allied health practitioners and trials and regulatory agencies in different countries working together, above all, there's hope. And that's the thing that's going to carry us forward to live with our cancers today, prevent the cancers that are coming in the future, and make sure that we do something meaningful for each individual person and for the population as a whole. With that, I will stop and figure out how to end my screen share and be willing to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosen, for that robust presentation. If you have questions, please put them at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to start with a question. So people with anal cancer live all around the country. Many are treated in community health settings that aren't necessarily connected to a major cancer center. So how that looks is we'll talk to patients who are doing their own research. They've been on clinicaltrials.gov, maybe they've spoken to other anal cancer patients. How do you suggest they bring up a clinical trial they may have found through their own networks or online with their community oncologist?
So it's a very common question, right? I think the first thing to do is really have that conversation with the doctor that you've been working with, right? What does he or she think? What does he or she think about my suitability for a clinical trial? And is there a major cancer center close by that I could go for a second opinion right now that would basically be able to look at that whole long list of trials? I practice in West LA. It's a very sophisticated internet savvy community where people will bring in reams of paper. And I can quickly go through and find that 40–50% of the trials are not appropriate for them and they may not even be open. So what it does is it engenders a conversation about what is it that we're trying to accomplish and how do clinical trials fit in. So my best advice is make sure that your doctor is communicating well with you and answering your questions, and hopefully identifying for you a major cancer center that's close by that it might be worth a trip for a consultation. In the world of video medicine, telemedicine, that can often be done over video conferencing. So it's not even so hard to travel. And get the philosophical principles about trials before you look at a specific trial. Of course, it's always helpful to mention them, but a lot of times we sort of kind of say, well, that's good, but I might do something else instead. It's just understand what the question really is. It's not about trial A versus trial B. It's about what are my goals of therapy? What are my available options? And how do I consider between number 1 and number 2 and number 3?
Okay, we've started to get some questions. Can you speak to the role that animal models play? I know you spoke to it a little bit, but we got a specific question asking how valuable are animal experiments compared to human trials?
So they're not so good, right? Sometimes they're great, but it's the best that we have, right? Before we're going to ask people to test a drug and put themselves in potential harm's way, animal rights really being important, we're going to test them in animals, right? And they're animals where their immune systems are suppressed so they can have human tumor cells implanted in them. Now, it's unrealistic to expect that that's exactly the same as a human tumor in a human, or that a drug will get to them in exactly the same way as a drug taken by mouth or IV. But we have the kinks worked out well enough to take it with a grain of salt. If we don't see activities in animals, we're probably not going to see it in humans either. If it's not safe in animals, it's not going to be safe in humans. But if it is, the opposite isn't true, right? It isn't necessarily going to work. So clinical trials are flooded with examples of, some companies saying they're curing cancer, some news article that says in animals we've cured cancer, and it doesn't turn out to be so in humans. So it's an important step, but taken with a grain of salt.
Okay. If you go on a clinical trial and it doesn't work, does that exclude you from other clinical trials? And I'm going to add a follow-up question here, which is there are a lot of emerging immunotherapies right now. And checkpoint inhibitors, for example, is one that has found some success in anal cancer. There are other trials that are currently ongoing. So the follow-up question will be, if you are tested with a similar immunotherapy, does that mean you can't go on another clinical trial that has kind of a similar mechanism of action?
Right. So it's what we talked about already, right? In the sense of when you're choosing your next therapy, whether it's a clinical trial or not, does it preclude you from doing anything in the future, right? So generally speaking, the answer is no. It doesn't matter when you're on a clinical trial. That doesn't preclude you from future clinical trials. Deal breakers would be if you take a therapy that doesn't work and you get very sick and God forbid your disease gets too advanced to withstand future therapy, you wouldn't be a candidate for future clinical trials. Some of the clinical trials are going to be only for people that have never had chemotherapy or treatment for metastatic disease before. So in the case of anal cancer, they've done chemo and radiation, the disease has come back, and they've never received any medicine yet. That might be a clinical trial. So if you've done something, whatever the something is, you wouldn't be able to enroll in that trial. Or in the example that you gave, you've had immunotherapy and the trial excludes people who have had prior immunotherapy. I would argue that it doesn't matter, right? Because if there's a drug that's so amazing, you weren't eligible for the clinical trial and it's just curing cancer right and left, it's going to be approved almost immediately, you'll get it. And if you don't get it, if it isn't approved, then probably it wasn't really that great anyway. If you had immunotherapy in the example that you've given, and you're excluded from a trial with a similar drug, you don't really want that trial anyway, right? Because your body already didn't respond to that treatment. With immunotherapy in general, we're beyond the Me Too phase now. So a lot of times we're specifically looking for people who've progressed off of immunotherapy to take a new kind of immunotherapy. And that's exactly what we want, is for you to have done it before. So it's very, very rare that your participation in a clinical trial, or again, in my example, the clinical trial shouldn't be thought any differently, your participation with regular chemotherapy will preclude you from getting something in the future. That's pretty rare. It is possible with those examples that I gave you, but it's pretty rare. So that's the conversation you should have with your doctor or the person that's putting you on the trial. Hey, if I go on this, what does it mean for future therapies? Because of course there could be some restrictions.
Thank you. What are the most promising new clinical trials that are being approached for metastatic anal cancer right now?
Right. So here's where I'm going to perhaps disagree with a lot of people in my field. And I'm going to encourage people with anal cancer to look very, very hard at phase 1 trials, right? Because anal cancer is not a common disease. And the business decisions behind cancer drug development in a world where cancer drugs are going to work against multiple different cancers, when you're looking at the phase 3 trials, there aren't really a lot of sexy things going on. And even in phase 2 trials, maybe they aren't. The newest, the sexiest, the best are going to be in the world of drug development or phase 1. Now, that doesn't mean that you want to look for the drug where you're the first person ever to test a mechanism of action. But again, if you come on the end of a phase 1 trial, so the drug that you're getting is already at its recommended dose, and we already have a good idea that it might work in anal cancer, or it might work in some specific way, then those are the clinical trials that I would consider. So the really exciting stuff right now is the world of immunotherapy, not the drugs that are available. Those are working really nicely in anal cancer. So I would bet that people that have metastatic anal cancer have already tried it. If it works, you won, right? And if it doesn't work, then I would be looking for people that are doing new kinds of immunotherapy or using the molecular targeting tests to see what about your cancer is appropriate. I can usually look at someone's molecular profiling, I can look at their case, and I can kind of figure out how they've responded to chemotherapy and immunotherapy for what type of trial to consider or what type of therapy to consider. I think most of us can do that. So the real answer to your question, what's the most exciting therapy in anal cancer, is the right one for you, right? And that's very, very different even in the context of the similar diseases. Back to my really important piece of advice is have a great conversation with your doctor. And if he or she isn't really connecting with you about your concerns, find perhaps somebody in a major cancer center that can do a consultation and help educate you about what to look for.
We also always recommend folks seek a second opinion, especially at an NCCN cancer center, if you can access one, or a major cancer center that is close to you.
Again, that's not hard in a world of telemedicine.
My insurance says it won't pay for experimental treatment, which I assume would be a clinical trial, but would the scan and test and visits still be covered?
Yes. So they're just saying they're not going to pay for the experimental therapy itself, and they shouldn't, right? So anybody that's trying to charge you for something that's unapproved, and this happens a lot in traditional medicine as well as complementary and alternative medicine. If someone is charging you for a therapy that isn't approved, probably should run away, because anything that's being scientifically tested should be paid for. And things like routine scans, not scans every 5 minutes. Remember, we talked about that trials will pay for any scans, doctor visits, blood tests, et cetera, that are not being specifically parts of routine care. So I've yet to meet an insurance company that won't pay for routine care.
A friend with metastatic anal cancer is using a dog dewormer to treat her disease. I'm not sure if this is something that's been prescribed by someone or they are doing self-treating. Animal studies seem promising. Are you familiar with this approach?
So I would rather lump that into things that look good in the laboratory that aren't being tested in a clinical trial. Should I do it? Right? So there's lots of things. You know, people have talked about insulin therapy from the 1950s. People have talked about different medications like in the veterinary world, or metformin, a diabetes drug, is supposed to have anti-cancer properties. And I think here's where I would say the opposite, right? They may look good in animal models, but they shouldn't necessarily be assumed to work in humans. And the idea of, well, it's not going to hurt me, so why not take it, is because maybe it will hurt you and it might interfere with your ability to get traditional cancer medicine or tolerate traditional cancer medicine. Believe it or not, it's really easy to get a clinical trial funded. There is so much need and so many foundations and so many government agencies that are funding cancer research, not just with pharmaceutical companies. It's very easy for me to write a grant and say, I have this drug that works in high blood pressure that I want to test in 20 patients. I can do it. I can prescribe the high blood pressure medication and I can collect rudimentary information that won't be so expensive for me and still publish a quick paper about the drug working or not working. It's so easy to do that, whether someone is in a cancer center or in a private office somewhere, that I would really try to dissuade people from doing things just because someone thought it might help when it hasn't really been validated in traditional testing. I understand it. I understand the need. But it could hurt.
Thank you. In terms of anal cancer, have you seen themes for non-responders versus exceptional responders?
Yes, but I don't know that I could tell you why. In other words, it's always a mystery to me why some people could have a scan that their entire lung is replaced by cancer and they're running marathons, and people can have a single tumor in their lung and not be able to breathe. Or people can have really aggressive disease that then becomes less aggressive. So the biology of cancer remains a mystery. What's the common theme? The person that is up and about and doing the best that they can to eat, get exercise, access care, but above all, live life. Those people do really, really well. Scientifically, I think we're trying to figure out, why do some people respond to immunotherapy and some don't, and pick another drug, right? That's the molecular profiling part. But I do think that's what I was talking about before, about the important conversation between you and your doctor. What is it about your case, not your blood test, not your scans, but what is it about you, the person, that can help me figure out what's the next treatment to do, whether that's traditional or experimental. A lot of times those clues are really obvious in an individual case that aren't going to be seen in a paper, in a clinical trial, in a presentation at a meeting, or a place on the internet.
Thank you. Do you have clinical trials now at your offices?
We have hundreds. We're a big cancer center. We're a big drug development program. I don't know that we have many trials that are specifically anal cancer, but that's my very strong belief that it shouldn't matter when you have a relatively rare disease. So there would be lots of drugs that I would be very excited to put anal cancer patients on, but I would say that that's the same thing for any major cancer center. I don't want to convey that there's anything magic about what's going on at UCLA compared to other major cancer centers around the world.
We are going to wrap it up now unless there are any more questions. I will check one more time. Okay. Yes, there's one more question. Can you speak about HIV and anal cancer clinical trials?
Sure. So the HIV world is really even more developed than the cancer world, right? There are tremendous groups, consortia of HIV doctors because anal cancer is quite common in the HIV population. And what's also very interesting is traditionally people with HIV were excluded from clinical trials because of either the virus itself when it was less under control, and also because of the drugs that are used to treat HIV, perhaps interfering with cancer medicine. And there's a lot of pushback now from the safety boards that we cannot, in my opinion, we should not be excluding people with HIV just because of the disease or their drugs. So there are less and less restrictions on HIV, and lots of work being done on interactions between HIV, viral load, the specific drugs, and the specific cancer, and whether molecularly anal cancers in the setting of HIV are molecularly behaving any differently. So very, very big active of research on the one hand. On the other, one shouldn't think about it any differently than any other person.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to wrap up the Q&A now. Thank you to everyone who joined us, of course, to you, Dr. Rosen, to the anal cancer thrivers who helped inform our content, and to the generous anonymous supporter who made this event possible. We are grateful to all of you. Our next event will be Immunotherapy 101 with Dr. Julia Strauss on Thursday, April 21st at noon Eastern time. If you come up with a question later, you can always email us at connect@analcancerfoundation.org, and we'll do our best to get you an answer. Thank you again, everyone. And thank you again, Dr. Rosen.
Thank you all for taking the time and for sponsoring this really important seminar.
Have a great day, everyone. Take care.
Bye.